Hello and welcome to Baiju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writer evaluates the violence faced by women on the grounds of their gender, caste, and disability. Essentially, the writer is evaluating the intersectionality of factors that contributes to violence against women in a society. See, intersectionality or intersectional approach is a theory which takes into account the cumulative effect of multiple sources of oppression. This term was first coined by popular intersectional theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a renowned lawyer and civil rights activist in the United States. According to her, violence against women in any society is based on an intersectionality of different factors, which makes women vulnerable to face such violence. According to her theory, women around the world are vulnerable on multiple grounds of oppression, including gender based discrimination, caste based discrimination, and as well as on the account of their religion, their disability, their sexual orientation, etc. This combination of factors gives rise to a cumulative effect, which directly contributes to targeted violence against women. The argument of thinkers, activists, and theorists such as Kimberly Crenshaw is that when you're looking at cases involving violence against women, you cannot look at it from just the perspective of gender. Yes, gender based violence is one of the factors, but this intersects with many other factors which could also be contributing to targeted violence against women. So, when an accused is being prosecuted, it's very important for the courts and the judiciary to look at the intersectional theory and hold the guilty accountable not just for gender based violence, but also for any other factors of oppression which might have led the accused to target particular women. So, if you look at India in particular, we do witness a lot of violence being committed against women, especially sexual violence. And many of these incidents are happening on the account of gender based discrimination, caste based discrimination, and as well as discrimination on the account of their religion, their disability, their sexual orientation, etc. So, that being the case, we cannot approach these incidents solely from the perspective of gender based violence, but the courts in particular will have to take into account the other intersectional factors, including caste, religion, disability, and other factors of oppression and discrimination. Now, to understand why the intersectional approach should be applied, we need to look at the Patan Jamalwali case, in which a 22-year-old blind Dalit woman was sexually assaulted, and the lower courts, including the High Court, had convicted the accused under the provisions of the Indian Penal Code and as well as under the relevant provisions of the Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989, and the accused had been sentenced to life imprisonment. This case was a classic intersection of gender, caste, and disability based discrimination leading to violence against women. Later, this case was heard by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did the right thing by upholding the intersectional approach with regard to gender and disability. The Supreme Court upheld the conclusion of the lower courts that the woman's gender and her disability had played a role in the targeted sexual violence seen against her, and hence the convicts need to be punished accordingly. But however, the writer argues that the Supreme Court made an error in judgment by failing to apply the intersectional approach on the grounds of gender and caste. While the lower courts had upheld the fact that the woman was a Dalit and this had a role in the targeted violence against her, and accordingly, the convicts had been charged under the SC and ST Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989. But the Supreme Court refused to apply this intersectional approach with regard to caste based violence, and this charge against the convicts was set aside. Even though the Supreme Court upheld life imprisonment for the convicts, this ruling of the Supreme Court has serious consequences because it represents a trend being seen with regard to caste based violence, where charges under the Prevention of Atrocities Act are being set aside by the court on the grounds that there isn't sufficient evidence to prove that the accused committed this act of violence based on the knowledge that the victim belonged to a lower caste. So now it becomes important to understand what was the purpose and the objective of the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, which was enacted by the Parliament in 1989. See, this act seeks to punish an accused with life imprisonment and a heavy penalty if the accused is not a member of the SC/ST community and if they have committed an act of violence against a member of the SC/ST community, and if this particular offence is punishable under the Indian Penal Code with a jail term of more than 10 years, then if the accused is proven guilty, he or she should be delivered a life imprisonment with a hefty penalty. The purpose of this law was to deter caste-based violence against SCs and STs, which are often committed by members of the upper caste based on their prior knowledge that the victim belongs to this community. Earlier, the law stated that if the accused committed this offense on the grounds that such a person is a member of the SC/ST community, then they could be held liable under the provisions of this act. But this provision that the victim just belonged to this community was leading to the misinterpretation and misuse of the law. It was amended in 2015 to change this provision, which currently reads to knowing that such a person is a member of the SC/ST community. That is, if the accused has committed this offense by knowing the fact that the victim belonged to the SC/ST community, then they are liable to be held guilty under the law with a life imprisonment. The strict provisions of this law have been designed to act as a deterrence against caste-based violence. And in the case of women belonging to the SC/ST community, if you apply the intersectional approach, it becomes very clear that women of the SC/ST community are more vulnerable to targeted sexual violence against them, not just on the account of their gender or maybe on the account of their disability, but even on the account of their caste. So in such cases, it's very important for the judiciary to consider the intersectional approach, and the accused simply cannot be acquitted under these laws just because there is a lack of evidence to show or to prove that the accused was aware of the caste of the victim. There have been many such cases where the accused have not been charged or punished under the Prevention of Atrocities Act just because of the lack of evidence. Because in such cases, the burden of proof lies clearly on the prosecution and the victim to prove that the violence was committed against them on the account of their caste. And since it may not be possible to provide such clear-cut evidence in every case, the accused are often acquitted by the courts. And even though they are punished under other provisions of the Indian Penal Code, they escape punishment under the Prevention of Atrocities Act. Now, this, according to the writer, also amounts to a miscarriage of justice because the frequent high acquittal rate under the Prevention of Atrocities Act sets a wrong precedent. Even the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Women and Children brought out in its report that in case of atrocities and crimes against women and children, there is a very high acquittal rate, especially when the accused have been charged under the Prevention of Atrocities Act. Even if the accused are held guilty under other provisions such as IPC, and even though they are given strict punishments, the fact that the court is not recognizing caste-based violence is a source of concern, and just the lack of clear-cut evidence is becoming a technical hurdle to counter caste-based violence. And if there is such a high acquittal rate, then it sets a wrong precedent, and it further instills more confidence amongst the upper caste and the dominant communities that they will not be held guilty and punished for targeted caste-based violence against the lower caste and lower communities. So considering this, it's very important for the courts to apply the intersectional approach. And while looking at gender-based violence against women, the courts need to consider caste-based violence as well and appropriately punish the guilty under the Prevention of Atrocities Act as well. Next, we have another column on page number 7 related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. In this column, the writer, who is an IPS officer, argues that one of the best ways to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict is to follow the Indian model, which led to the creation of the Indian nation state based on the principles of non-violence and peaceful coexistence. He argues that the Indian model of a nation state provides for an inclusive democracy and a secular state which is accommodative of all religions, of all faiths. And this is the only realistic model which can help resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict in a non-violent, peaceful manner. To further understand the significance of his argument, one needs to look at the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you remember, I covered this discussion in detail on the 12th of May, and for a more detailed analysis of the background to the Israel-Palestine conflict, you can go back and watch this video. But here, for the sake of this article, we can briefly cover the historical events and understand why the path of violence and conflict is not a viable path for Israel and Palestine, and the only realistic solution for this conflict should be based on the principles of non-violence and peaceful coexistence, just like the Indian model. See, at the center of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the conflict over Jerusalem. As we discussed the other day, Jerusalem, the sacred city, is the birthplace of all the three Abrahamic religions, that is, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. There is no doubt about its cultural and historical significance to all the three faiths, and hence, no single religion can claim ownership over Jerusalem. To be fair and neutral, Jerusalem neither belongs to the Jews, nor to Islam, nor to Christianity alone. It belongs to all the three faiths, and it is this acknowledgement that should be at the very center of any effort to resolve this conflict. See, as colonial Britain renounced its mandate over Palestine in 1948, the United Nations, which had been recently set up following the end of the World War, had proposed a two-state solution as a viable solution which would provide for two separate countries, one for the Jews and one for the Palestinian Arabs. But this two-state solution of the United Nations never came into existence because it was preempted by Israel, which unilaterally declared independence against this mandate of the UN. And in direct violation of international law, Israel established itself as an independent nation exclusive for the Jews. This left the Palestinians behind and destroyed their hopes of having their own separate state, which could protect their rights and opportunities. Immediately after becoming independent, Israel started committing grave atrocities against the Palestinians, which the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba or as the Holocaust, during which Israel destroyed hundreds of Palestinian villages and pushed out nearly 80% of its Arab population, thereby establishing a dominant state of Israel that was exclusive for the Jews. The other Arab Muslim countries fought back against Israeli oppression, and they even though declared war against Israel, eventually they were defeated by the Israeli state, thereby pushing back the efforts of the Arab countries to protect the rights of the Palestinians. Then came the Six-Day War of 1967, where the Arab states made another attempt to violently target Israel and protect the rights of the Palestinians. But again, Israel emerged victorious, and it not only took over many Palestinian territories, but this time it even annexed the Sinai Peninsula or the Sinai Desert of Egypt, and as well as the Golan Heights of Syria. Then, even in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, it was again Israel which emerged victorious over the Arab countries. And these successive defeats of the Arab states made it very clear by the 1970s that Israel was here to stay. And this forced the Arab countries to reset their equation with Israel. And many of them even reset their relations with Israel, including countries such as Egypt. So slowly through the 1980s and 1990s, the Arab support started dwindling for the Palestinian cause. And this was marked by the parallel rise in Palestinian counter-violence, beginning from the 1970s, and through two uprisings or rebellions that Palestinians refer to as the Intifada. Palestinians have taken up counter-violence and even acts of terrorism to target Israel for its oppression and to liberate the Palestinian areas from Israeli occupation. This counter-violence has given birth to many radical extremist organizations such as the Hamas, the Hezbollah, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the others, who have received covert support from many Arab Muslim countries and non-Arab Muslim countries, thus creating a vicious cycle of violence in the Middle East, where the Israeli state doesn't hesitate to even target Palestinian civilians in the name of counterterrorism. And the Palestinian extremists, such as Hamas, do not hesitate to target Israeli civilian population in the name of national liberation. According to the writer, this cycle of violence continues till date, and it is very essential for all the parties involved in the conflict to accept the current realities on the ground and realize the fact that Israel is not going anywhere as a state, and the justified demands of the Palestinians is not going to be erased just by the use of violence and force. The writer says that it would be wishful thinking on the part of Israel to assume that the Palestinian movement can be wiped out with the usage of force and with the adoption of aggressive policies. Similarly, it would be wishful thinking for the Palestinians to assume that someday they can wipe out Israel from existence. And hence, it's important for both the parties to acknowledge that the nation state of Israel is here to stay. And at the same time, Palestinians have a justified demand for recognition of their territorial rights and as well as for equal rights and opportunities, which has been denied to them for decades together. Over the decades, many attempts have been made to work out a solution, but they have all failed as they are largely based on the European model, which pushes for an unfair settlement between the victors and the losers. And the European experience in creating nation states in the Americas, in Australia, and as well as in Europe shows that their nation state model is always based on the annihilation of the natives and the minorities. A classic example would be the creation of Nazi Germany based on the annihilation of Jews. And now the irony is that the very same Jews who faced these atrocities back in Europe are seen to be committing similar atrocities against the Palestinians, depriving them of their justified rights. So while the European model is based on the annihilation of natives and minorities, and while it provides for an unfair settlement between the majority and the minority groups, it would be better and more realistic to focus on the Indian model of a nation state, which provides for an inclusive democracy to all the groups, and it provides for a secular approach irrespective of its religious composition, and it tries to accommodate people of different faith, different communities, different ethnicities, and different languages, and creates a ground for an equitable society where equal rights and opportunities are guaranteed through the Constitution. According to the writer, such a non-violent, peaceful model has to be the best solution, the best realistic solution for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. See, it is true that any nation-state model is based on the identity of the majority group or the majority community. There is no denying that. But that doesn't mean creation of such a nation-state should be based on violence and inhumanity against the minorities. Now, given the fact that Israel is highly unlikely to cede the Palestinian territories which are under its occupation, and since the Palestinians have lost numerous opportunities in the past to carve out their own nation, the only viable solution is for the Palestinians to coexist within Israel, where the Israeli state guarantees equal rights and opportunities to the Palestinians with complete protection of their rights under a secular, inclusive, and accommodative constitution. The only reasonable and practical solution should be based on humanity, and just like the Indian model, it should be driven by the principles of non-violence and peaceful coexistence, where all communities, irrespective of their religion or irrespective of their race, ethnicity, or language, are given equal rights and opportunities. And hence, the secular, inclusive India model happens to be the best practical solution for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. China has relaxed its family planning rules to allow couples to have a third child. See, for many decades, China was infamous for restricting its population policy by enforcing a controversial and inhuman one-child policy. Beginning from the 1980s, China had strictly enforced a one-child policy in order to keep its population under check. And in many cases, this policy was not only deemed to be inhuman because of the ways in which it was being enforced, but it was also seen to be discriminatory against the poor and the lower classes. Then recently, China woke up to the threat posed by this policy because its demographic dividend was taking a negative turn as a result of this policy. China realized that due to its one-child policy, its population was aging very quickly and the working age group was falling as a result of a massive decline in new births. So to address this upcoming demographic problem, China had recently revised its family planning rules and it had allowed a two-child policy. But within 5 years, China has realized that this policy is also not enough to address the upcoming demographic challenges, and hence it has decided to revise the policy again by allowing a third child. According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, its latest census data has shown a massive decline in new births, and very soon China's population is expected to hit a peak. And estimates around the world predict that by 2025, India is going to race ahead of China, and India would become the world's most populous nation, while China's population would start falling after 2030. And by the middle of this century, by somewhere around 2050, China would have a very high population of old people. And this aging population not only increases the need for care, but parallelly, China would also witness a massive decline in the working age population, which in turn would directly affect its economic growth. So, to address this upcoming demographic challenge, China has revised its family planning rules. And just 5 years after introducing the two child policy, it has revised the policy to allow couples to have a third child. Next, we have an important update on the Indian economy in this article on page number 1. According to the article, the National Statistical Office has come out with the national income estimates for India. And according to this data, India's GDP growth has contracted by 7.3% for the last financial year. This contraction in the Indian economy happens to be the biggest contraction seen in the last 60 years, and it has been a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns. When the country went into its first lockdown last year, India's GDP growth in the first quarter dropped by a massive 24.4%. After having registered this negative growth of 24.4%, in the second quarter, India's GDP growth shrunk by 7.4%, and GDP growth returned to positive territory only in the third quarter to register a marginal growth of 0.5%. Compared to the first 3 quarters, the fourth quarter witnessed better performance, and a positive GDP growth was registered again with a growth rate of 1.6%. So overall, the estimation was that India might register a negative GDP growth of -8%, but the latest estimates indicate that India has shown a better performance with a GDP growth of -7.3%. Next, in a related article on page number 12, it has been reported that India has recorded a fiscal deficit of 9.2% of its GDP for the previous financial year, which happens to be a slight improvement over the revised estimates of 9.5% as per the data that has been brought out by the Controller General of Accounts. This better than anticipated performance with regard to India's fiscal deficit is a result of increase in revenue collection due to better receipts from customs and excise duty. Next, on page number 5, we have an article that makes a reference to the controversial draft laws that have been proposed for Lakshadweep in order to bring better development and governance to these island territories. In previous sessions over the last week, we have discussed this topic in detail, but here this article makes a reference to Article 240 of the Indian Constitution, and hence, for the sake of prelims and mains, you should be aware of the provisions of Article 240 of the Constitution. This article empowers the President of India to make regulations to enable peace, progress, and good government in union territories such as the Andaman Nicobar Islands, Lakshadweep Islands, Diu Daman, and Dadra Nagar Haveli. These provisions also apply for the Union Territory of Puducherry, but when the legislature is not functioning. It is under this provision that the administrator of Lakshadweep has proposed these draft laws, which have been currently sent to the MHA for further approval. But the lack of local consultation with regard to these draft laws have triggered a controversy in Lakshadweep, as the locals feel that these laws proposed by the administrator violates the economic, social, and cultural rights of the local people. Now let's look at this article from page number 8. The Defense Ministry has notified the second negative import list, which is also being seen as the positive indigenization list. See, last year, in order to drive up defense indigenization and to promote the principles of Make in India and to promote the agenda and the objective of Atmanirbhar Bharat, the Defense Ministry came out with a negative import list, which prohibited the import of these listed defense equipment and defense products, which instead will have to be procured locally by the armed forces in order to support defense indigenization. The first negative import list brought out last year contained more than 100 items, and now the second negative import list or the positive indigenization list has been brought out with a list of 108 defense products, weapons, and platforms. It includes sensors, simulators, weapons and ammunitions like helicopters, AWACS systems, medium power radars, medium range surface to air missiles, etc. So, going forward, the armed forces and the defense ministry will have to focus on procuring these listed items locally, that is through local indigenization, instead of importing them. This is essentially import substitution in order to promote defense indigenization in line with the spirit of Make in India initiative and the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. Then finally, we have this article on page number 11, which highlights the plight of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh who are being forcefully rehabilitated at the Bashan Char Island. And the concerns about their living conditions and their safety has been highlighted even by UN agencies such as the United Nations Refugee Agency and the UNHCR. See, the Rohingya Muslims who have faced communal violence in the Rakhine state of Myanmar are essentially seen to be the natives of the Cox's Bazar and Chittagong area, which is located in today's Bangladesh. But over the centuries, the Rohingya Muslim community migrated from the Cox's Bazar Chittagong area and they had settled in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. But the modern state of Myanmar started discriminating against the Rohingyas, and at the hands of radical Buddhists, with the support of Myanmar's government and Myanmar's army, the Rohingya minorities have been targeted and persecuted, and for decades together, they have been the victims of targeted communal violence. This has triggered a refugee crisis in the region, and Rohingya refugees often flee into other countries, especially to Bangladesh and as well as into India and other Southeast Asian countries. Following recent incidents of violence in the Rakhine state, lakhs of Rohingyas have fled into neighboring Bangladesh and they have sought refuge in the Cox's Bazar Chittagong region. So, Bangladesh, which has been dealing with the Rohingya refugee crisis, came out with a controversial relocation plan when it decided to set up a huge refugee camp at the Tengar Char Island located over here, or also known as the Bashan Char Island since 2019. This relocation plan of Bangladesh has turned out to be controversial because the Bashan Char Island is a low-lying island that has been formed due to Himalayan silt deposition. This low-lying island is very vulnerable to climate change and global warming, and it is directly in the line of high-intensity cyclones that form in the Bay of Bengal. So as a result, the Bashan Char Island is highly vulnerable to coastal flooding and rising sea levels, which in turn places the Rohingya refugees who are to be rehabilitated over here at great risk. So human rights organizations around the world and even UN institutions have expressed concern about these plans of Bangladesh. And this article on page number 11 makes a reference to the protests carried out by Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh against their forceful relocation to the Bashan Char Island. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: caste-based violence against women needs to be recognized in India. In the light of the statement, evaluate how effective is the SC and the ST Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989. The second question: Israel and Palestine will have to seek a solution through non-violence and could take a leaf out of India's book. Examine the statement. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.